An age of prosperity, confidence, and unquestioned power. History would later remember this era as the calm before the collapse, but those who lived within it called it the Age of Balance. The empire stretched from the cold northern seas to the sunburned southern plains, its borders secured by treaties, fortresses, and a reputation no rival dared to challenge. Maps of the known world placed it at the center, not merely by geography, but by influence. Trade routes bent towards its cities, kings measured their legitimacy by its approval, and even distant nations spoke its name with a mixture of admiration and quiet fear. At the heart of the empire stood the capital, vast, orderly, and alive. Marble avenues reflected the morning sun, and towering structures of stone and steel rose like declarations of permanence. Engineers had mastered bridges that defied rivers, roads that stitched continents together, and aqueducts that carried life itself across miles of barren land. Technology, for its time, felt miraculous. Innovations once imagined by philosophers now existed in the hands of craftsmen and scholars. The political system appeared unshakable. Power flowed through institutions refined over generations, councils that debated policy, courts that enforced law, and an executive authority believed to be both wise and restrained. Leaders spoke of continuity, stability, and destiny. Elections, appointments, and successions occurred without bloodshed. To the citizens, governance felt predictable, and predictability bred trust. The economy flourished in ways unseen before. Markets overflowed with grain, metals, spices, textiles, and inventions. Merchants grew wealthy, artisans earned respect, and even laborers found work in abundance. Currency was stable, trade agreements secure, and famine a memory whispered by elders. Wealth did not belong solely to the elite. It flowed just enough to convince the masses that prosperity was permanent. Children were born into certainty. They learned in schools funded by the state, taught that the empire's rise was not accidental but inevitable. History lessons glorified expansion, diplomacy, and the moral superiority of their system. To question the empire's future was not forbidden, it was simply unnecessary. The military, though formidable, remained mostly unseen. Its presence was felt in symbols rather than bloodshed. Banners flying from distant forts, disciplined parades through city streets, veterans honored rather than feared. Wars, when they occurred, were swift and decisive. Enemies surrendered before true devastation could begin. Victory had become routine. Confidence settled into the culture like an unspoken law. Artists painted visions of eternal dominance. Writers spoke of an empire that had outgrown decline itself. Philosophers debated ethics and meaning, not survival. Even religion adapted, preaching that divine favor rested firmly upon the empire's foundations. Foreign diplomats arrived regularly, bearing gifts and flattering words. Some sought alliance, others protection. None arrived with threats. Intelligence reports spoke of unrest beyond the borders, tribal conflicts, struggling kingdoms, fragmented coalitions, but none appeared capable of challenging imperial might. Those dangers felt distant, almost theoretical. Yet beneath the surface of perfection, small fractures had begun to form. They were subtle, easily dismissed, a delayed shipment here, a minor rebellion there, a political compromise that favored short-term calm over long-term truth. Advisors noticed inefficiencies but hesitated to raise alarms. After all, the system had worked for centuries. Why would it fail now? In the outer provinces, citizens felt a quiet shift. Taxes increased slightly.
Military recruitment intensified. Governors rotated more frequently than before, disrupting local stability. These changes were explained as administrative adjustments, nothing more. Most accepted the explanation. Faith in the center was absolute. The elite lived in a different rhythm. Banquets grew more extravagant, debates more self-congratulatory. Power consolidated quietly, masked by tradition. Decisions were made by fewer voices, justified by the need for efficiency. Transparency faded, replaced by ceremony and reassurance. Technology, once a unifying force, began to create distance. Advanced tools and systems benefited the capital first, then the inner regions. Outer territories waited, sometimes indefinitely. Innovation, instead of lifting all equally, started to reveal divisions. Still, optimism dominated. Travelers spoke of safety across roads that spanned thousands of miles. Farmers trusted the seasons and the state's granaries. Investors funded ambitious projects that promised progress for generations to come. The future, it seemed, was already secured. What no one fully grasped was how fragile complexity could be. The empire had grown vast, so vast that its strength depended on perfect coordination. A single disruption in trade could ripple outward. A single political miscalculation could destabilize entire regions. A single loss of trust could not be easily repaired. But such thoughts belonged to pessimists and scholars, not to a people living at history's peak. In taverns and forums, conversations centered on opportunity, not danger. Young men dreamed of careers, not battlefields. Families planned generations ahead. The idea of collapse felt almost offensive, as if doubting the sun's next rise. Even the most cautious minds underestimated the power of unseen forces. Beyond the borders, rival powers watched carefully. They studied the empire's confidence, its routines, its dependence on stability. They noted how strength had replaced vigilance, how success had softened instincts once sharpened by survival. They waited, not for weakness, but for inevitability. Inside the capital, records show the final months were marked by celebration, anniversaries, triumphs, public works inaugurations. Leaders addressed crowds with words like eternal, unbreakable, destined. The language of permanence echoed through halls built to last forever. And yet, history does not move in straight lines. Change rarely announces itself with thunder. More often, it arrives quietly, disguised as routine, hidden behind comfort, ignored by those who believe themselves immune. The empire stood at the height of human achievement, unaware that its greatest enemy was not at the gates, but woven into its certainty.
The rise of a forgotten empire. How a once unknown civilization rose to dominate history. Before the empire reshaped continents and dictated the fate of nations, it existed only as a footnote, if it existed at all. Nestled between mountains that few dared to cross and plains that offered little mercy, the civilization began in obscurity. There were no legendary founders blessed by the gods, no golden capitals, no inherited claims to greatness. What they possessed instead was necessity, and necessity proved to be a ruthless teacher. Survival was never guaranteed. Harsh seasons, limited resources, and constant pressure from neighboring powers forced the people to adapt quickly or disappear entirely. Where larger civilizations relied on abundance, this society learned discipline. Where others celebrated tradition, they questioned it. From the beginning, they understood a truth history often forgets. Strength is not inherited, it is constructed. Leadership emerged not through bloodline, but through competence.
In times of crisis, those who could organize, plan, and act decisively rose to the forefront. Authority was practical, not ceremonial. Leaders were expected to deliver results, not speeches. Failure was not romanticized, it was studied. This mindset shaped their earliest military doctrine. Unlike rival powers that prized numbers and spectacle, this civilization focused on efficiency. Soldiers trained not only with weapons, but with maps, logistics, and communication. Commanders learned to read terrain as carefully as enemy movement. Every campaign was planned around minimizing loss and maximizing advantage. Their first conflicts were defensive. Repeated incursions from stronger neighbors threatened their existence. Instead of reacting with desperation, they observed patiently. They studied enemy habits, supply routes, and weaknesses. When they finally struck back, it was not with rage, but precision. Entire threats were neutralized before full-scale wars could begin. These early victories did more than secure borders. They reshaped identity. Confidence replaced fear. The people began to believe not only in survival, but in potential. A collective understanding emerged. If discipline could protect them, strategy could expand them. Expansion came slowly. Unlike empires that surged forward in reckless conquest, this civilization advanced deliberately. Each new territory was secured economically before being claimed politically. Roads were built before banners were raised. Governance followed immediately after military success, preventing chaos and rebellion. They did not rule through terror. Conquered populations were studied, not erased. Local leaders were often retained, laws standardized, and customs respected where possible. The empire offered something rare in an unstable world: predictability. Taxes were measured, justice was consistent, infrastructure improved visibly. Resistance, once expected, often dissolved into cooperation. Trade accelerated their rise more than war ever could. Positioned strategically between powerful regions, the empire became a vital artery for commerce. Goods moved efficiently under imperial protection. Merchants carried stories of safe roads, fair courts, and enforced contracts. Wealth flowed inward, funding further expansion without overburdening the core. With wealth came innovation. Engineering advanced rapidly. Fortifications became smarter rather than larger. Weapons lighter, faster, more reliable. Communication systems allowed commanders to coordinate across vast distances with unprecedented speed. Strategy became a science, documented, debated, refined. Military academies replaced hereditary command. Promotion was earned through performance, not lineage. This created loyalty not to individuals, but to the system itself. Soldiers trusted their leaders because those leaders had proven themselves. Rival civilizations struggled to understand this new power. From the outside, the empire appeared restrained, almost cautious. It avoided grand declarations of dominance. It rarely issued threats. Diplomacy was preferred when possible. To older empires accustomed to displays of strength, this restraint was mistaken for weakness. That illusion proved costly. A coalition of established powers eventually formed to contain the growing influence. They believed numbers and tradition would ensure victory. What they failed to recognize was how deeply the empire understood them, how thoroughly it had studied their tactics, politics, and internal divisions. The conflict that followed was swift and decisive. Rather than meeting armies head-on, imperial forces targeted supply lines, communication hubs, and alliances themselves. Enemy commanders found themselves isolated, unable to maneuver or reinforce. Cities surrendered not after sieges, but after realizing resistance was futile. Within months, powers that had dominated the region for centuries were forced into treaties that reshaped the balance of history. From that moment, the civilization could no longer be ignored. Yet even as its influence expanded across continents, it resisted proclaiming itself an empire. Titles remained modest. Rulers spoke of stewardship rather than destiny. This humility, real or strategic, disarmed critics and delayed unified opposition. Cultural influence soon surpassed military reach. Language spread through trade and administration. Imperial law became the standard for contracts and governance. Education systems produced administrators loyal to imperial principles rather than local rivalries. Art and architecture blended styles from conquered lands, creating a shared identity without erasing diversity. The empire became not just a power, but a framework. Generations grew up knowing no other order. Stability bred loyalty. Prosperity reinforced belief. Even those who remembered independence admitted life had improved under imperial rule. And yet, history is unforgiving. The very traits that enabled the empire's rise, discipline, confidence, strategic control, would one day become sources of vulnerability. Expansion increased complexity. Success bred complacency. Systems built for efficiency demanded perfection to survive. But that reckoning lay far in the future. In its moment of ascent, the empire stood as proof that greatness does not always announce itself. Sometimes it emerges quietly, forged by necessity, refined by intelligence, and carried forward by people who learned to adapt faster than the world around them.
Alliances formed in public, betrayals planned in shadows. Power, once secured by conquest, must be preserved by politics. As the empire expanded, its leaders quickly learned that enemies no longer always carried weapons. Many wore smiles, exchanged gifts, and spoke the language of partnership. Victory on the battlefield had brought influence, but influence invited competition of a far subtler kind. In the great halls of the capital, alliances were announced with ceremony and celebration. Treaties were signed beneath towering banners. Envoys praised unity, cooperation, and shared prosperity. To the public, the empire appeared surrounded by friends. To those who understood power, it was surrounded by rivals waiting patiently for advantage. Politics became the new battlefield. The empire's ruling council grew larger, more complex, and more divided. Military commanders, economic architects, regional governors, and ideological leaders all claimed a voice in shaping the future. Consensus, once efficient, became fragile. Every decision carried consequences beyond borders. Foreign powers studied these divisions carefully. They sent ambassadors skilled not in negotiation, but in manipulation. Promises were made in public, while counteroffers circulated in private. Trade agreements concealed intelligence operations. Cultural exchanges masked political influence. Every alliance was layered with contingency plans. The empire responded in kind. A network of informants and advisors emerged, scholars by title, strategists by function. They mapped not only territories but loyalties. Which allies depended on imperial trade? Which feared imperial expansion? Which leaders could be swayed by ambition and which by fear? Information became the most valuable currency. Some rulers within the empire welcomed this new era of diplomacy. They saw opportunity in cooperation, believing shared interests would ensure stability. Others warned that trust was a vulnerability. The debate was constant, unresolved, and increasingly personal. Ego entered the equation. As the empire's reputation grew, so did the pride of those who led it. Generals who had never lost a battle believed themselves infallible.
Governors ruled provinces larger than entire former kingdoms. Advisors competed for influence, framing policies not only for the state's benefit, but for personal legacy. Decisions once grounded in strategy began to reflect ambition. Public unity masked private rivalry. Factions formed within the ruling structure, each promoting a different vision of the empire's future. Expansionists demanded continued dominance. Stabilizers warned of overreach. Idealists argued for moral leadership. Pragmatists focused solely on control. Foreign powers exploited these fractures expertly. One rival kingdom, weakened by military defeat, shifted tactics. Unable to challenge the empire directly, it sought to entangle it diplomatically. Treaties multiplied. Joint councils were formed. Military cooperation was proposed, not to strengthen the alliance, but to expose weaknesses. In private, that same kingdom funded dissent within imperial provinces. Another power pursued economic warfare. It flooded markets with cheaper goods, undermining local industries while praising imperial free trade policies. When unrest followed, it positioned itself as mediator, offering solutions that increased dependency. Even allies competed silently. Smaller states aligned with the empire for protection, but feared absorption. They formed informal coalitions among themselves, sharing intelligence and coordinating positions. Their loyalty was conditional, their gratitude temporary. Within the empire, secrecy became routine. Decisions were increasingly made behind closed doors. Emergency powers were justified as necessary precautions. Transparency was sacrificed for efficiency. Trust, once assumed, is rarely defended. The military remained loyal, but even its unity was tested. Commanders received conflicting orders shaped by political agendas. Strategic clarity blurred. Some generals were promoted for loyalty rather than competence. Others were sidelined for speaking inconvenient truths. The consequences were subtle but cumulative. Diplomatic victories replaced military ones as measures of success. Treaties were celebrated even when they resolved nothing. Stability was maintained, but tension increased beneath the surface. Rivals no longer sought immediate collapse, they aimed for exhaustion. History records one particular agreement as a turning point. Presented as a landmark alliance, it promised peace, shared defense, and economic cooperation across multiple regions. Publicly, it was hailed as the foundation of a new era. Privately, its clauses bound the empire to obligations that limited strategic freedom. Opposition existed, but it was fragmented and cautious. Those who warned of hidden dangers were labeled pessimists or obstructionists. Success taught the empire to equate caution with weakness. Confidence silenced dissent more effectively than censorship ever could. Meanwhile, foreign rivals waited. They did not need invasion, they needed time. Time for internal divisions to deepen. Time for overconfidence to dull instincts. Time for the empire to mistake complexity for control. In diplomatic gatherings, smiles concealed calculation. Every handshake was measured, every concession noted. The empire, accustomed to shaping outcomes, failed to recognize how often it was being shaped in return. By the time awareness began to surface, habits had hardened. Power had shifted from battlefield to boardroom, from generals to negotiators, from clear enemies to ambiguous partners. The rules had changed, but the empire was slow to adapt. Politics had succeeded where armies could not. The storm was still invisible. No borders had fallen, no capital burned, yet the foundations had begun to weaken, not from attack, but from entanglement. Alliances, once symbols of strength, became instruments of pressure.
Rivalries, once open, now thrived in silence.
Voices of the common men and women history almost ignored. Empires are remembered by the names of their rulers, the dates of their victories, and the borders they redraw, but they are built and sustained by people whose names never appear in chronicles. Beneath the crown, beyond the marble halls and ceremonial banners, lived millions whose lives were shaped by decisions they would never influence. Farmers, laborers, merchants, soldiers, mothers, and children carried the weight of empire not in speeches or treaties, but in their daily choices to endure. In the countryside, life followed the rhythm of the land. Farmers rose before dawn, measuring seasons more carefully than politics. They knew when rains arrived late or taxes increased, their survival narrowed. Imperial reforms promised stability and often delivered it, but at a cost. New regulations standardized harvests, imposed quotas, and demanded efficiency. For some, it meant predictability. For others, it meant pressure that never eased. Yet hope persisted. Granaries built by imperial decree reduced famine. Roads connected villages to markets once unreachable. A bad year no longer meant certain ruin. People learned to adapt, just as the empire had taught them. In the cities, opportunity and anxiety lived side by side. Artisans found new customers as trade expanded. Markets buzzed with languages from distant lands. Prosperity was visible, but uneven. Wealth gathered faster at the center, leaving outer districts struggling to keep pace. Workers labored long hours building infrastructure they might never use fully. Aqueducts, walls, ports, and administrative buildings rose on the strength of human endurance. Wages were steady, but exhaustion was constant. Pride in contributing to something greater mingled with quiet resentment. Soldiers experienced the empire most directly. Many enlisted not out of loyalty, but necessity. The army offered food, pay, and purpose in uncertain times. Training was rigorous, discipline absolute. For some, it provided identity. For others, it was a sentence measured in years of separation from family. They marched under banners they respected, even when they did not fully understand the politics behind them. Victories were celebrated, losses quietly absorbed. Veterans returned changed, carrying scars both visible and hidden. The empire honored them publicly, but few truly understood the cost of their service. Women bore a different burden. They managed households during long absences, negotiated survival during shortages, and passed down cultural memory. While rarely acknowledged by official records, women sustained communities. They adapted to reforms, taught children, and preserved traditions as the empire expanded and blended cultures. Some found opportunity in change, education, trade, or administrative roles once closed to them. Others felt their freedoms narrow under standardized laws that ignored local customs. Progress, like power, was uneven. Children grew up believing the empire was permanent. Schools taught imperial history as destiny. Maps showed expansion as natural order. Careers were planned around stability. Few questioned the system, not because questioning was forbidden, but because uncertainty felt unnecessary. Yet even children sensed tension. They overheard conversations about taxes, conscription, and distant conflicts. They watched elders calculate risks carefully. They learned early that loyalty and caution were equally necessary. Not all resistance was loud. In some provinces, dissent took the form of quiet withdrawal. Farmers underreported yields. Merchants rerouted goods. Local leaders delayed enforcement subtly. These acts were not rebellion, they were survival strategies.
The empire tolerated small disobedience as long as order remained intact. Control, after all, was measured in stability, not obedience. Stories from this era survive only in fragments: letters, records, and oral histories. A mother writing to her son in uniform, a merchant noting rising fees, a laborer describing the exhaustion of endless construction. These voices reveal a truth absent from official narratives. Greatness felt different from below. For many, the empire represented both protection and pressure. They benefited from peace, trade, and law, but they also lived with constant awareness that decisions made far away could reshape their lives overnight. War meant loss, diplomacy meant change, prosperity meant adjustment. Fear rarely came from invasion, it came from uncertainty. What would the next reform bring? Would taxes rise? Would sons be conscripted? Would traditions survive another generation of standardization? These questions lingered quietly, rarely voiced openly. Yet loyalty endured, not because the empire was flawless, but because it provided something rare in history: predictability. People adapted their dreams to fit within its structure. They found meaning in family, work, and community. They learned to live between pride and doubt. As long as the crown held firm, most believed endurance would be rewarded. History would later judge the empire by its collapse, but during its height, it was the people beneath the crown who sustained it, not through glory, but through persistence. Their lives, largely unrecorded, formed the true foundation of power.
One decision, one moment, one irreversible consequence. History rarely collapses in a single blow. More often, it turns on a moment so small it seems insignificant, until it is too late to undo it. For the empire at its height, that moment arrived not on a battlefield, but in a quiet chamber where decisions were made far from the public eye. The empire had many enemies, but none who openly challenged it. Its borders were secure, its alliances intact, its influence unquestioned. Stability had become routine, and routine, over time, had dulled caution. The issue at hand appeared minor. A border province, strategically valuable but politically fragile, had become the subject of dispute between the empire and a long-standing ally. The province was rich in resources and vital to trade routes. Local unrest had increased, fueled by competing promises from both powers. What was needed, most believed, was careful diplomacy. A delegation was assembled. Among them was a senior imperial envoy, a respected figure known for moderation rather than aggression. His task was simple: reaffirm alliance, calm tensions, and secure shared access to the province. There were no expectations of conflict. The journey itself was treated as routine, but routine breeds vulnerability. Unbeknownst to the council, factions within the empire saw opportunity in escalation. Some believed the ally had grown too independent. Others feared weakness would invite further challenges. A decisive display of authority, they argued, would restore balance. These voices were not dominant, but they were persuasive. During negotiations, tensions surfaced quickly. Words were measured, but meaning was contested. Each side suspected the other of duplicity. Advisors whispered interpretations, each shaped by their own interests. Trust, once assumed, began to fracture. Then came the decision. Late into the talks, a report arrived, unverified, ambiguous, and urgent. It claimed imperial citizens had been attacked in the disputed province. The source was unclear, the details incomplete, yet the implications were explosive. The envoy requested time to confirm the information. He was denied.
A faction within the council, acting without full consensus, authorized a response intended to send a message, not of war, but of strength. A limited military action, a demonstration, swift and controlled. It was meant to end the crisis. Instead, it ignited it. Imperial forces moved quickly, occupying key positions in the province. No declaration was issued, no ultimatum delivered. To those involved, it felt decisive. To the ally, it felt like betrayal. Within hours, the envoy was dead. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say he was assassinated by local extremists. Others claim he was killed in the chaos that followed the occupation. What is certain is this: his death transformed a diplomatic dispute into an existential crisis. The ally responded immediately. Treaties were declared void, forces mobilized, appeals were sent to other powers, some sympathetic, others opportunistic. What had been a controlled display became a public rupture. Inside the empire, shock gave way to confusion. The council scrambled to regain control of the narrative. Public statements framed the incident as defensive. Responsibility was deflected. Internally, accusations flew. Who authorized the action? Who failed to verify the report? Who allowed the envoy to be exposed? No single answer emerged. What followed was not war, not yet, but something more dangerous: escalation without clarity. Allies hesitated. Rivals advanced quietly. Markets reacted instantly. Trade slowed. Confidence wavered. The empire, accustomed to shaping events, now reacted to them. The military prepared for contingencies, but lacked a clear directive. Diplomats attempted damage control, but trust had evaporated. Every message was scrutinized, every gesture misinterpreted. The death of one man had shattered the illusion of control. In the provinces, rumors spread faster than official statements. Some spoke of conspiracy, others of inevitability. Citizens sensed a shift, not in policy, but in certainty. The system still functioned, but faith in its judgment faltered. Foreign powers took notice. They did not rush to attack. Instead, they adjusted positions, strengthened alliances, and waited. The empire's greatest asset, its stability, had been compromised. Time now favored those patient enough to exploit confusion. Within the ruling council, unity collapsed. Factions hardened, decisions delayed, authority fragmented. Leaders once confident now second-guessed every move. The decisive edge that had built the empire dulled under fear of further mistakes. Attempts to reverse the decision failed. Apologies were rejected. Concessions demanded more concessions. The original objective, stability, had vanished, replaced by survival. The empire was no longer setting terms. It was responding to consequences. Historians would later argue whether the decision was inevitable. Some claimed the empire was already overstretched. Others insisted different choices could have preserved peace. What remains undeniable is this: a single, poorly examined action exposed every underlying weakness at once. The spark did not destroy the empire, but it revealed how fragile greatness had become. From that moment on, the future shifted. The empire still stood. Its armies remained strong, its cities prosperous. Yet something essential had changed.
War without mercy. Battles that redefined courage, fear, and survival. War arrived not with a single declaration, but with 1,000 sudden absences. Trade caravans stopped crossing borders. Letters went unanswered. Garrisons doubled their watches. The empire did not announce war to its people. There was no need. Everyone felt it. In markets, prices rose. In homes, silence lingered longer than usual.
Along the frontiers, soldiers prepared for something they hoped would never come, yet knew was inevitable. When the first clash occurred, it was brief and brutal. A forward outpost, isolated, lightly manned, strategically minor, was overrun before dawn. The loss meant little on a map, but everything to those who survived it. News traveled fast, stripped of detail and heavy with implication. This was no longer a diplomatic crisis. This was war. The empire mobilized with speed born of experience. Legions assembled, supply lines activated, commanders reviewed plans refined over decades. On paper, the empire remained superior, better trained, better equipped, better organized. Confidence lingered among the high command. Wars had been won before. This one, they believed, would be no different. They were wrong. The enemy did not fight as expected. Instead of large formations and decisive engagements, they struck unpredictably, harassing supply routes, disrupting communication, retreating before confrontation. Terrain became a weapon, weather an ally. The empire's strength, once an advantage, now slowed response. For soldiers on the ground, theory vanished quickly. The first major battle unfolded on an open plain, bordered by forests and shallow hills. At dawn, formations moved into position, banners rose, drums echoed. For a moment, the world narrowed to discipline and order, everything soldiers had trained for. Then chaos broke through. Arrows fell from unseen positions, flanks collapsed under sudden pressure, units advanced only to find the enemy already gone. Commands conflicted, signals failed. Courage was no longer about advancing, it was about holding together. Fear spread faster than strategy. Men fought not for glory, but for survival. Shields locked, lines broke. Regrouping became instinct rather than instruction. By nightfall, the field belonged to no one, only the wounded and the silent. Victory was declared by both sides. Neither believed it. As weeks turned into months, the empire consumed resources and resolve. Battles blurred together, some large, others skirmishes barely recorded. The empire adapted, but adaptation came at a cost. Losses mounted, veterans fell, new recruits filled ranks with courage untested and fear undisguised. Mental exhaustion rivaled physical injury. Soldiers slept lightly, if at all. Every sound suggested attack. Every delay bred suspicion. Comrades disappeared between marches, claimed by wounds, illness, or the quiet breaking point no report could measure. Commanders faced impossible choices: hold ground and risk encirclement, or retreat and surrender morale, protect civilians or preserve fighting strength. Every decision saved lives somewhere and condemned them elsewhere. There was no clean victory, only trade-offs written in blood and memory. Civilians suffered without weapons or armor. Cities near the front emptied as families fled with what they could carry. Farms burned, not always by intent, but by proximity. Food shortages followed. Refugees crowded roads once built for commerce, not escape. The empire tried to respond, but logistics strained under constant disruption. War did not ask permission. Inside the capital, maps changed daily. Lines advanced, retreated, and blurred. Public speeches emphasized resilience and unity. Privately, leaders confronted a truth they could not speak aloud. This war could not be controlled. The enemy learned quickly. They studied imperial patterns, targeted predictable responses, and avoided decisive confrontation. Their goal was not immediate victory, but exhaustion. Every mile advanced cost the empire twice the effort to hold. Every battle won left fewer soldiers to fight the next. The empire's greatest advantage, organization, became a vulnerability. As casualties increased, discipline frayed. Orders delayed by political oversight arrived too late. Promotions based on loyalty replaced merit. The clarity that once defined imperial command dissolved into hesitation. Yet, amid despair, acts of courage emerged. A unit held a bridge long enough for civilians to escape. A medic worked through exhaustion to save strangers who would never know his name. A commander refused retreat, buying time at the cost of his own life. These moments did not change the war, but they defined humanity within it. Fear and bravery became indistinguishable. Soldiers learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Survival depended on trust in comrades, in instinct, in the hope that endurance still mattered. One battle, remembered only by its location, marked a turning point. Imperial forces committed fully, seeking decisive victory. The engagement lasted days. Advances were made, lost, and made again. When it ended, the field was silent, not with defeat, but with realization. Even success now felt hollow. The cost was too high. The empire still stood, its armies still fought, but the war had redefined it. No longer invincible, no longer confident, survival replaced dominance as the objective. War without mercy leaves no room for illusion. It strips away certainty, exposes limits, and demands payment long after the fighting ends. For the empire, the storm had arrived fully now, not as sudden collapse, but as relentless pressure.
When victory became impossible to define. The empire still fought its enemies beyond the borders, but its most dangerous battles had begun within. At first, the signs were subtle: a delayed payment to soldiers, a shipment of grain rerouted unexpectedly, a governor requesting emergency funds for reasons left unexplained. None of these events, on their own, suggested collapse. Empires endured worse, but together they marked a shift no victory on the battlefield could correct. The war dragged on longer than anyone had predicted. Campaigns once measured in seasons stretched into years. The cost was no longer counted only in lives lost, but in resources drained. Trade routes that once fed the empire's wealth were disrupted or abandoned entirely. Markets grew volatile. Prices rose unevenly, hitting the poorest first and hardest. In the capital, officials spoke of sacrifice. They framed shortages as temporary, inflation as manageable, dissent as isolated. Public addresses emphasized resilience, urging citizens to endure for the greater good. Many listened, many believed, but belief is fragile when daily life contradicts promise. Taxes increased quietly at first. New levies were introduced under the language of necessity: defense contributions, emergency assessments, patriotic obligations. For the wealthy, these were inconveniences. For the working class, they were devastating. Farmers sold future harvests to meet present demands. Merchants closed shops rather than operate at a loss. Laborers worked longer hours for shrinking wages. Economic strain reshaped loyalty. People who had once accepted imperial authority without question began to ask what they were paying for. The war no longer felt distant. It lived in empty shelves, unpaid wages, and sons who did not return home. Within the military, cracks widened. Supply shortages forced commanders to make impossible choices: who received food, who waited, which unit advanced, which was left exposed. Morale suffered. Veterans recognized patterns of mismanagement they had never seen before. Orders arrived late or contradicted one another, shaped more by political pressure than strategic clarity. Leadership faltered under the weight of its own complexity.
The ruling council, once decisive, became fragmented. Factions blamed one another for setbacks. Meetings grew longer, resolutions weaker. Fear of accountability replaced boldness. No one wanted to own failure, but failure no longer required ownership to spread. Charismatic figures rose briefly, promising reform and renewal. They spoke of restoring purpose, of redefining victory, but charisma could not compensate for exhausted systems. Promises without resources became another source of resentment. In the provinces, unrest took on new forms. It was not rebellion, not yet, but refusal. Communities delayed tax collection. Local officials quietly ignored directives. Militias formed not against the empire, but to protect against instability. The center's authority weakened not through violence, but through irrelevance. Information traveled faster than control. Rumors filled the gaps left by official silence. Stories of corruption, betrayal, and incompetence circulated widely, some exaggerated, others disturbingly accurate. Trust eroded. When leaders spoke, citizens listened with skepticism rather than confidence. The war effort suffered accordingly. Recruitment declined. Desertion increased. Soldiers questioned objectives they no longer understood. What had once been a fight for security now felt like an endless obligation with no clear end. Victory became difficult to define. Was it holding territory, ending hostilities, preserving the empire itself? Each answer implied a different strategy, and none seemed achievable without unacceptable cost. The enemy no longer needed to defeat the empire outright. They needed only to wait. Foreign powers sensed the shift. Allies grew cautious, renegotiating commitments. Neutral states distanced themselves diplomatically. Rivals intensified pressure, not always through force, but through economic and political leverage. The empire's influence waned incrementally, almost invisibly. Inside the capital, symbols of power remained intact. Ceremonies continued, laws were passed, banners flew. But beneath the appearance of continuity, something essential had broken. Confidence, the unspoken agreement between rulers and the ruled, was gone. Citizens no longer asked when the war would end. They asked whether it ever would. Even those who remained loyal felt the weight of doubt. They remembered a time when the empire's decisions brought clarity rather than confusion. That memory, once a source of pride, became a measure of loss. History often marks collapse with dramatic moments, a final battle, a fallen capital, a captured ruler. But collapse begins earlier, quietly, when systems fail faster than belief can sustain them. For this empire, the beginning of the end was not defeat. It was exhaustion. Exhaustion of resources, exhaustion of leadership, exhaustion of faith. The machinery of power still moved, but without purpose. The war continued, but victory no longer promised renewal, only survival, and even that felt uncertain. The storm had not yet destroyed the empire.
The fall that shook the known world. No empire ever believes it will fall. At its height, the empire had stretched beyond the horizon, its banners flying over deserts, rivers, and ancient cities whose names were older than memory itself. Maps painted it in bold colors, as if ink alone could guarantee permanence. To its people, the empire was not merely a political force, it was the world. Its laws governed time, its currency defined value, and its armies shaped reality. Yet history is unforgiving to those who confuse dominance with destiny. The collapse did not begin with fire, it began with silence. The crumbling heart of power.
The capital city, once a marvel of stone, order, and ambition, had become a place of tension disguised as routine. Grand avenues still hosted processions, but the cheers sounded thinner. Marble palaces still reflected sunlight, but behind their walls, fear replaced confidence. Senators whispered where they once debated openly. Advisors measured every word, knowing loyalty could turn fatal overnight. The ruler, once hailed as the embodiment of imperial strength, now sat surrounded by uncertainty. Decisions that once seemed decisive now arrived too late or struck too hard. The empire's vastness, once its greatest strength, had become its weakness. Messages from distant provinces took weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. By the time commands were issued, rebellions had already evolved, alliances had shifted, and enemies had adapted. The empire was still standing, but its foundation was cracking. The provinces break away. Far from the capital, governors faced impossible choices. Taxes demanded by the crown drained already suffering populations. Soldiers were unpaid. Grain shipments disappeared into corrupt channels. When famine struck, imperial aid never came, only orders to maintain control at any cost. Some governors remained loyal out of honor or fear. Others chose survival. Local leaders began to act independently, forming regional militias, negotiating with old enemies, even declaring autonomy under the pretense of temporary stability. What the capital called treason, the provinces called necessity. The idea of a single unified empire, once unquestionable, began to feel distant, even irrelevant. The empire no longer ruled by unity, only by habit. The last war and the final illusion. The empire's final war was supposed to restore its glory. Military strategists promised a decisive campaign against an external rival, a war that would remind the world who still commanded history. Recruitment posters spread across cities, invoking honor, legacy, and fear of annihilation. Young men marched, believing they were defending civilization itself. What they encountered was chaos. Supply lines collapsed under their own weight. Commanders contradicted one another. Mercenary forces switched sides for better pay. Battles were fought not for victory, but for survival. Fields once green with crops turned red with blood, then black with ash. There were moments of courage, soldiers shielding one another, medics working beyond exhaustion, civilians hiding strangers at the risk of their own lives. But courage could not compensate for a system already hollowed out. The empire lost not because it lacked soldiers, but because it had lost purpose. The fall of the capital. When the enemy reached the outskirts of the capital, many expected a legendary last stand. It never came. The city's gates, symbols of invincibility for generations, were opened not by force, but by betrayal. Guards deserted their posts. Officials fled with whatever wealth they could carry. Fires broke out, not from siege engines, but from looters and panicked citizens. The streets filled with screams, prayers, and the sound of collapsing structures. Libraries burned, taking centuries of knowledge with them. Statues were torn down, not by conquerors, but by citizens venting years of suppressed rage. The palace fell last, not in a dramatic battle, but in eerie quiet, its halls already empty. The ruler was captured, killed, or vanished. History would never agree. What mattered was that power no longer had a face. The empire ended not with a roar, but with exhaustion. Cultural extinction and lingering echoes. After the fall, the world did not immediately change.
Roads still existed, laws were still quoted, coins still circulated, but something essential was gone, the belief in continuity. Languages fractured into dialects, traditions faded without institutions to preserve them. Artisans lost patrons, scholars lost protection. Entire generations grew up knowing the empire only as a cautionary tale told by survivors. Yet fragments endured. Architectural techniques influenced future builders. Legal principles resurfaced centuries later in new governments. Military doctrines were studied by rivals who had once feared them. Even in death, the empire shaped the world it failed to control. Its collapse became a lesson, one humanity would repeatedly forget. Why the fall still matters. To modern audiences, the story feels disturbingly familiar. An overextended power, internal division, leaders disconnected from reality, economic inequality, endless war justified by past greatness, confidence that this time is different. The empire believed its systems were too advanced to fail. Its citizens believed collapse was something that happened to others, to weaker civilizations, less enlightened societies. History proved otherwise. Empires do not fall because they are attacked. They fall because they stop listening, stop adapting, and stop valuing the people who sustain them. By the time the walls crumble, the collapse has already happened within. The world after the empire. In the ruins of the fallen capital, grass eventually grew between stones. Children played where soldiers once marched. Traders set up markets among broken columns. Life, indifferent to power, continued. New powers rose. New empires claimed permanence. New leaders promised stability. And somewhere beneath the dust of time, the fallen empire waited, not to return, but to remind.
The world after the fall. Survivors, successors, and a new global order. When the empire fell, the world did not pause. It moved forward, as it always does, indifferent to the grandeur or the failure of any single power. In the ruins of once mighty cities, survivors rose from the ash, carrying both memory and necessity. They carried lessons learned and some mistakes repeated, because history rarely forgives carelessness and even more rarely rewards foresight. The first challenge was survival. Former citizens of the empire, stripped of centralized protection and resources, faced famine, disease, and lawlessness. Without armies to enforce order, villages armed themselves, neighborhoods became fortresses. Trade, once managed with imperial precision, fractured into regional networks. Merchants adapted, sometimes partnering with former enemies, sometimes simply fleeing with goods to safer lands. In markets and settlements, the pulse of life returned slowly, but it returned differently. The rise of new powers. While survivors struggled, new powers filled the vacuum. Some were provinces that had previously been minor territories under imperial rule. Now, with armies intact and leadership intact, they claimed sovereignty and legitimacy. Others were external neighbors, once hesitant to challenge the empire, now confident and opportunistic. Borders shifted, alliances formed and dissolved, and the old maps, once filled with bold colors representing a single ruler, were redrawn again. These successor states varied in ambition and capability. Some sought to emulate the fallen empire, restoring its systems and laws to maintain continuity. They built roads, standardized trade, and created armies loyal to the state rather than a single ruler. They believed that replicating the structures of greatness would restore stability. In some cases, this worked.
New states thrived for decades, learning the lessons of overreach and internal discord that had doomed the old empire. Others took a different path. They rejected imperial models entirely, decentralizing authority and empowering local communities. These societies were often slower to recover economically, but they avoided the catastrophic central failures that had toppled the empire. Their leaders relied on negotiation, local militias, and regional councils. Authority became flexible rather than absolute, shaped by necessity rather than ideology. Lessons learned or ignored. The fall of the empire was a cautionary tale, but lessons are selective. Some successors studied records meticulously, military campaigns, economic policies, diplomatic correspondence. They sought to avoid overextension, excessive taxation, and centralized arrogance. They understood the fragile balance between authority and popular trust. Yet other leaders ignored these warnings. Human ambition is rarely deterred by past mistakes. Pride and urgency often outweighed caution. Wars broke out not from necessity, but from opportunity. Borders were redrawn by chance as much as design. Some successor states repeated the same errors the empire had made, believing themselves immune to history. Even in failure, the empire's influence endured. Architectural marvels inspired new capitals. Legal codes resurfaced in new governments. Trade practices and administrative systems inspired rulers who had never lived under imperial rule. Art, literature, and philosophy reflected both nostalgia for the old world and the realities of the new, creating a culture of hybrid identity. Religious and cultural institutions, previously managed or co-opted by the empire, either dissolved or redefined themselves. Some maintained continuity, preserving texts, traditions, and ceremonies. Others innovated, blending influences from multiple regions, resulting in a dynamic and sometimes unstable cultural landscape. Economic rebirth. Trade, the empire's bloodline, returned gradually. Ports reopened, routes were cleared, and markets stabilized. Former imperial currency lost value, replaced by regional coinage or bartering systems. Merchants adapted with ingenuity. Smaller caravans, decentralized trade networks, and negotiated tolls replaced imperial oversight. Over time, wealth concentrated in emergent centers rather than a single capital, dispersing power and reducing the likelihood of systemic collapse in the future. Agriculture rebounded. Farmers learned to manage risk independently of a distant capital. Crop rotation, localized storage, and community defense allowed regions to survive shocks that would have devastated a centralized system. Food security became less uniform but more resilient, a lesson hard earned from the empire's over-reliance on centralized supply. The psychological aftermath. Perhaps most importantly, survivors carried memory. The empire's fall shaped political philosophy, collective psychology, and generational thinking. People learned to question authority, value local autonomy, and scrutinize leaders. Fear of unchecked power became part of governance. Generations remembered both the grandeur and the collapse, creating societies attuned to risk and responsive to caution. Yet memory was double-edged. Some communities clung to nostalgia, idealizing the empire's order and cohesion, ignoring the flaws that led to its demise. This selective memory inspired ambitious leaders to attempt reunification or imperial restoration, efforts that sometimes succeeded briefly but rarely endured. Global realignment. As decades passed, the world settled into a new configuration. Former imperial provinces became independent nations, some large and influential, others small and strategic. New alliances formed, sometimes lasting, sometimes shifting with the tides of opportunity. Diplomacy, warfare, and trade created a complex, multipolar world far more fluid than the old empire's rigid hierarchy. Power was distributed rather than concentrated, a lesson painfully learned from history. This new order also allowed innovation. Smaller, nimble states experimented politically, economically, and culturally. Borders were more porous. Ideas spread faster. Knowledge moved more freely. Competition, once monopolized by a single authority, fueled creativity, resilience, and adaptation. Legacy of the fallen empire. Though gone, the empire's shadow remained. Architectural marvels inspired new capitals. Legal systems influenced emerging governments. Military strategies informed generations of commanders. Its failures, overreach, internal division, and the neglect of popular trust became case studies for leaders who wanted survival more than glory. A new dawn. As the sun rose over a rebuilt world, life moved forward. Children played in streets where banners once flew. Markets thrived along rivers that had carried imperial grain. Scholars taught without fear of political purges. Soldiers trained to defend communities rather than conquer continents. And in every region, leaders understood the precariousness of authority, a hard-won knowledge from the ashes of the old empire. The world had changed irrevocably. Old mistakes became guides, old victories became warnings, and amidst the ruins and reconstruction, humanity persisted, ever adaptive, ever resilient, and ever aware that even the greatest empires are fleeting.
Why this lost empire still matters today. The ruins of an empire are more than relics. They are warnings etched in stone, written in blood, and whispered through generations. Though centuries have passed, the lessons of the lost empire reverberate in the corridors of modern power, in the markets of global trade, and in the minds of leaders who believe that strength alone guarantees longevity. History rarely repeats exactly, but it often rhymes. The empire, once unchallenged, fell not from a single enemy, but from compounded flaws, overreach, arrogance, mismanaged ambition, and the disconnect between rulers and the ruled. Soldiers could not fight fast enough, markets could not adjust quickly enough, and leaders could not recognize the cracks forming beneath their own feet. And so the unthinkable became inevitable. Power and its fragility. Modern leaders might study the rise and fall of the empire and notice a familiar pattern. Power without accountability is brittle. Consolidation of authority, while efficient, concentrates risk. Wealth, when hoarded at the center, generates resentment, instability, and eventually revolt. Technology, law, and military might alone cannot guarantee loyalty or trust. In today's world, these lessons are relevant. Nations wield unprecedented technological and economic power. Global trade binds continents. Military alliances stretch far beyond home borders. Yet the greatest threats to stability often come not from outside, but from within: mismanagement, corruption, inequality, and hubris. The empire's fall reminds us that the tools of power are only as strong as the relationships that sustain them. The price of pride. Hubris was perhaps the empire's deadliest enemy. Leaders believed their authority was unassailable. Advisors were ignored if their counsel contradicted pride. Decisions were made for the sake of ego rather than effectiveness. Confidence, once a virtue, became blindness. Today, pride still undermines states.
Politicians, CEOs, and policymakers sometimes overestimate their own infallibility, ignoring warning signs until consequences are unavoidable. The empire illustrates vividly that arrogance can erode even the strongest institutions faster than external threats ever could. Governance and the people. The empire survived for centuries because it adapted when necessary, but it eventually forgot the people it ruled. Policies that ignored the well-being of ordinary citizens created resentment, while reliance on rituals, bureaucracy, and appearances substituted for genuine engagement. Once public trust eroded, loyalty evaporated, leaving a hollow structure vulnerable to both internal collapse and external attack. Modern democracies, autocracies, and emerging governments alike face the same truth. Lasting power depends on legitimacy in the eyes of the governed. Without it, even armies and wealth cannot prevent decline. Civic engagement, transparent leadership, and attention to the needs of the populace are not optional. They are the foundation of stability. Economic lessons. The empire's economy was initially a marvel. Trade networks spanned continents, markets flourished, and prosperity was celebrated. Yet over-centralization, corruption, and overextension made the system fragile. When conflict disrupted supply chains, famine, unemployment, and inflation followed swiftly, demonstrating the delicate balance between wealth accumulation and equitable distribution. In today's interconnected global economy, a similar principle applies. Over-reliance on a single market, dependence on concentrated industries, or neglect of infrastructure and human capital can amplify minor disruptions into systemic crises. The empire's collapse reminds us that sustainable growth is measured not just by profit, but by resilience. Military might and strategic limits. The empire's armies were feared across continents. They had discipline, technology, and strategy unmatched by neighbors. Yet military might alone could not preserve the empire. Overextension strained resources, created logistical nightmares, and exposed leadership errors. Battles were lost not because of weaker foes, but because the empire's own systems were overstressed, fragmented, and undermined by internal politics. In modern terms, this teaches that military superiority is necessary but insufficient. Strategy, adaptability, and understanding one's own limitations are as critical as strength. Nations that fail to consider long-term consequences risk defeat even with seemingly unassailable power. Diplomacy, alliances, and betrayal. Throughout the empire's history, diplomacy was both a tool and a trap. Alliances were formed publicly, betrayals planned in the shadows. Rivals exploited divisions, while internal factions weakened decision-making. This duality, where appearances masked reality, ultimately hastened collapse. In contemporary geopolitics, the lesson is clear. Alliances and agreements require vigilance, transparency, and mutual understanding. Trust is a currency as valuable as gold or weaponry. Misjudgment, assumption, or complacency can turn partners into adversaries overnight. Cultural continuity and memory. Despite the empire's physical and political collapse, its cultural, technological, and intellectual contributions endured. Architecture influenced future cities, military strategies informed new generals, and legal codes were adapted by successor states. Civilization moves forward not only through conquest, but through adaptation and memory. For modern audiences, this demonstrates that influence survives beyond the lifespan of governments. Ideas, values, and innovations can outlast dynasties, shaping societies centuries later. The empire's fall is not only a tale of ruin, it is a source of knowledge and inspiration. Reflection for today. In America and across the world, the echoes of this lost empire are unmistakable. Concentrated power, overconfidence,
Economic inequality and political polarization all carry potential consequences. Leaders must balance ambition with humility, authority with accountability, and innovation with responsibility. Citizens must remain engaged, informed, and vigilant. History, if ignored, can repeat itself, not as a warning, but as inevitability. The empire's story is also a reminder of resilience. Though it fell, the world endured. Survivors adapted, new powers rose, and human civilization continued its relentless march forward. Collapse, while tragic, does not guarantee finality. Adaptation and learning are humans' true legacy. A final thought. History written in blood and stone is not merely a record of failure. It is a guide, a mirror, and a challenge. The empire's triumphs demonstrate what ambition and organization can achieve. Its failures reveal the cost of neglect, pride, and disconnection. Modern societies, whether nations, corporations, or communities, carry the same lessons in their structures, decisions, and values. To ignore them is to risk repeating mistakes. To study them is to wield knowledge that can shape a more resilient and just future. The lost empire no longer commands armies or issues decrees. Its palaces lie in ruin, its banners are dust, but its lessons remain vivid, etched into the very foundation of human history. Power is temporary, pride is perilous, governance is responsibility, prosperity is fragile, and survival depends on learning from the past, not merely remembering it. In the end, the empire still matters, not because it still exists, but because its story, written in blood and stone, continues to speak to every generation willing to listen.